So as we think about defining what fun in the workplace, if we think of it that way, really looks like, there was this paper in 2009 where Eric Lamb and Michael Meeks defined workplace fun as playful, social, interpersonal, recreational, or task activities intended to provide amusement or pleasure. So I think we could say what we're really talking about here with having fun is creating this sort of atmosphere that fosters enjoyment of the moment that you're in, even when that moment is particularly challenging, right? So it's not
Mm.
just fun for fun's sake, and it's not that every moment's going to be the best and not hard or challenging, but creating fun in those moments that can be challenging, and that may be through lightheartedness or gratitude or shared victories or things of that nature. It's really finding those instances of joy, meaning, and satisfaction in the work and fostering that environment where people feel energized, engaged, and really invested. What's unprofessional about that?
I think that's really helpful to clearly differentiate from having fun to being irresponsible or unprofessional or even like behavior that would consider to undermine your leadership. That is not what we're going for. And we're not saying that
Sure.
leaders shouldn't be professional, they shouldn't be responsible, and the fun cannot undermine the character. It really supports it. Like it really tells your team what your character is. And as I'm hearing you sort of define this and that paper talking about what it means, what I'm hearing is connection. And we've talked about this before. You need to care about your team. And this is really part of that. It's that you're not a robot,
Mm.
that you are able to connect even during stressful times with your team and being light, fun, all those things you talk about. That really is part of it. It certainly is different to invigorate and inspire than to be goofy and irresponsible. Now that we've got an idea of what we're talking about in terms of a definition, do you have an example that would help demonstrate this to our listeners of what it looks like in a leadership role to have fun in the midst of work and in the midst of leading others?
Sure. I have a bunch really. We can think of all sorts of things like things from medical training, being a resident and medical student. Those would come to mind when talking about challenging situations and also having fun. But one that really jumps right to mind, and those who have listened to our previous episodes will be familiar with Rick Loudon and the impact he had on my life and still has on my life. But Rick is a great example, I think, of a leader who always made it fun. So whatever we were doing, he made it fun. I worked with Rick at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in the early 1990s. And our offices and labs were in what was called the metals and ceramics facility. This was a large, relatively
Pottery?
new building, okay, that was, built in the late 1980s. It probably cost at that time 50 to $100 million to
Mm.
build. And so it was a really high-end, scientific building where we did all this research. And Rick had this, it was particularly funny thing that he would do. And Rick is not the tallest guy. So he's I think Rick's probably somewhere around 5'7", 5'8", maybe. And so we're walking along through this building, right? And if we were walking along and Rick would trip or catch his toe on the floor, he'd stop and he'd turn, and he'd point to the floor and he'd say, "There's a high spot there. We need to mark it so that no one else trips." And then as if he were some sort of self-appointed safety officer, and I don't know where he'd gotten this tape, but he had this yellow black, striped tape that he would go get, this sort of barricade tape, and he would make these big X's on the floor and leave them there, for safety's sake, right? So consequently, throughout this multi-million-dollar cutting edge high-tech research facility, you would see Rick's X's, each representing those so-called high spots. And that was fun. And honestly, it was a bit ridiculous, among other things that Rick would do. But it showed every member on the team that Rick didn't take himself too seriously, and it was okay to have fun. Even when we were doing really important stuff for the Department of Defense and so forth. We had a great time, and our team was exceptional, I think, as a result, right? We developed this camaraderie and esprit de corps, and so as a result of that, we were able to get so many projects done ahead of schedule, which is not common in a government facility. And we developed a number of innovative materials and applications for those. And I think it was directly related to Rick's leadership and his ability to find fun in what was otherwise serious and potentially really mundane work. So that's one that really jumps to my mind and just makes me like I have a lot of great memories of that.
I love that. It's so true that teams that have fun together have greater camaraderie, which we know increases team performance. As you're telling that story, I just hear connection. Like I can see the two of you walking down and you're going to some important meeting. That happens, and instantly you're like two friends. Like you're just two friends, not really goofing off, but you got to see a little bit of his personality and character without him undermining his own leadership characteristics, integrity. I think that's so hard to do. It's a great example of how he was able to do that and to bring your team together and to bring their performance really to the highest level.
Yeah. And another thing, just as you're saying that, that comes to mind is this idea, fun. A lot of times we think about fun, we think about humor and that sort of thing. Rick was the object of the joke, right?
Mm,
He didn't make anybody else the object of good leaders never make somebody else the butt of the joke. As a leader, if you're going to make a joke, either nobody is impugned or you're the butt of the joke. And typically, I think it works best if you're the butt of the joke, right? If you start making other people the butt of the joke, that really undermines your leadership. So I think that's something that's a good point. Think about how might we undermine ourselves. That's one way that I see all the time. People trying to make jokes and they just undermine themselves and it doesn't go well. But anyway, so that's one of mine. What about you? Do you have a story that showcases kind of how having fun or why having fun is valuable and accomplishing the mission or things like that?
yeah, I think of one of my mentors that sort of demonstrated fun in their leadership style, and it was almost hand in hand with sort of what you were just talking about, was their demonstration of humility. They were in a leadership role, but not completely separate. They were able to have a characteristic of humility that was so important in their own leadership. And it was one of my attendings in the ICU when I was an ICU fellow, Robert Spear, and he's a guy you would describe as sort of an eclectic man, like, and he would often use humor, usually in the form of a very odd analogy or story to make a point, usually a very valuable teaching point. And sort of as you pointed out, he wasn't derogatory. He didn't use sarcasm at someone else's expense. He didn't make someone else on the team isolated, separated, put down so that he can make a point. He would just usually come up with these very strange things that you wouldn't connect and sort of use that analogy to really drive the point home. And while these stories and analogies usually seemed ludicrous and were filled with hyperbole and they often sort of I just had no idea where he was coming up with them, they would really solidify a point. These stories and their humor stuck with me much longer than if he had not used that. And he could have been critical about certain decisions or plans of care, but instead was able to interject humor, often at his own expense, to make a point. While sometimes this may be done, like as you said, with sarcasm and to the detriment of others, humor and fun may be used to help solidify a point without belittling others. And I think that's a really important point because I do agree when people get this wrong, a lot of times they don't feel comfortable about their own limitations. They don't have or comfortable with their own humility and they sort of point the humor, the sarcasm to somewhere else, and that's when not only is it not helpful to the team, but it can be a detriment, and that's a real tough thing to get right, and I think that's probably the real crux of this whole thing is not only using humor, fun, but using it correctly.